Jonathan Lamb remained silent for years. Devoted to the image, devoted to the legacy. However, he finally talks about the billion-dollar wealth his father left behind in a startling interview. Everything is altered by what he tells about the inner workings of Daystar, the pressure, the power conflicts, and the reality of the bequest. Was it a gold-wrapped curse or a blessing? You won't believe what he just told you and why it's causing such a ruckus in the religious community. There was no question for years regarding who would continue the Daystar network and Marcus Lamb's legacy. Everyone assumed it would be Jonathan Lamb, his son, both inside and outside the ministry. It wasn't merely a hunch, though. It was official, documented, and in writing. It was a signed, sealed, and pledged plan that selected Jonathan as the new president of the billion-dollar Christian empire. This was not a suggestion made over dinner or whispered in family gatherings. It was dark and white. Marcus Lamb had stated that his son will succeed him. He wanted the enormous Christian media behemoth he had created to remain in the family. Jonathan had grown up surrounded by the spiritual mission, the sermons, and the cameras. He was aware of the duty. He was prepared to continue after witnessing it all come to life, studio light after studio light, brick by brick. Following Marcus' untimely death in 2021, there was both clarity and, of course, grief. At Daystar, Jonathan assumed the position of vice president. It was the next logical step. Everyone thought the way forward was clear. He was already assuming his father's public position, working full-time, and taking on more leadership duties. That position came with a good salary. Jonathan and his wife Susie felt financially secure for the first time in years. According to ministry standards, they were not wealthy. Their mortgage was still in effect. Although they continued to pay their obligations, it was a comfort to not have to live paycheck to paycheck. Finally, after years of humble living, things were improving. However, there is an ancient story out there. They're multimillionaires, I see. They were employed by this multimillionaire ministry. Has this had a financial impact on you guys? Has it negatively impacted your finances? As JAR's vice president, I had an extremely high wage. Only 23, is that correct? Oh, number 22. Did you get that large bump at that time? We were always typical for 2023 prior to then. It was still a pleasant no, I must say. Yes. No, but in 2022, it was really big. Vice president full-time for a full year. Yes. We were shaken. Whoa, we thought. People want to pretend that you are still making mortgage payments. Yes. Still have to pay the bills that come in from leading a lifestyle that used to need a much higher income. Susie, after all, got a raise as well. They were finally living the life they had always imagined. Steady, safe, and purpose-driven. They were creating a future that they had worked for and believed in, not one that had merely been handed to them. The title belonged to Jonathan. It was his duty. Most significantly, he had his father's approval documented, formal, and lawful. He held the throne. The empire was prepared for transfer. However, nothing is ever that easy, particularly when it comes to authority. Although the public perceived Jonathan as the behind the scenes, something changed with the natural succession. The signed agreements and the established plan were not being followed. It began modestly. Hesitancies, tone shifts, and whispers. Then it became evident that decisions were being made by someone else. The ship was being navigated by someone else. Jonathan started to lose the promise of leadership and carrying on Marcus' legacy. And it had nothing to do with his actions. It had nothing to do with his failure. He refused to sacrifice his integrity, which is why, when things weren't going well, he wouldn't act like they were. When something didn't feel right, he wouldn't play along with it or smile. And there was a price for that decision, that boundary he refused to cross. Jonathan was prepared for everything. There were the papers. It was obvious what was expected. The public was prepared. However, Daystar's internal politics had shifted. And all of a sudden, what had been promised seemed more like a danger than a benefit. He had to confront a heartbreaking reality. Writing something down does not guarantee that it will be followed. A legacy is not guaranteed to be preserved just because it is created. Additionally, being next in line does not guarantee that you will be given the throne, particularly if you speak up. Susie and Jonathan found themselves at a fork in the road. They could either remain silent and preserve the empire, or they could speak up and jeopardize everything. Everything would alter depending on their decision. Everything still appeared flawless from the outside. Daystar continued to broadcast shows. The cameras and lighting remained in place. The ministry machine continued to roll. The Lamb family appeared to be unified to the public. Jonathan served as the vice president. Although Joni continued to serve as a leader and the network appeared solid, it was actually collapsing. Truth honoring had always been important to Jonathan Lamb. He grew up in a household that believed that Christian principles should be practiced, not just taught. Additionally, for the majority of he attempted to accomplish it throughout his life. However, Jonathan began to change after his father, Marcus Lamb, passed away. It was more than grief. It was more profound, as if his faith in the system he was born into was gradually eroding. The alterations were silent at first. He didn't agree with some of the decisions that were being made. Influence suddenly came to those who shouldn't have had it. Inquiries were being avoided, and more significantly, he believed that the legacy his father had established was being altered, not with accuracy, but with practicality. Jonathan made an effort to remain silent. He made an effort to make it work. However, the more he assumed leadership roles, the more difficult it became to remain silent. Behind closed doors, he witnessed things that unnerved him. The actual breaking moment then arrived. Pete, a Daystar employee, and his family are involved. Member, as well as an extremely unsettling charge regarding Jonathan and Susa's 5-year-old daughter that completely altered the course of events. Since he was elected president before everything really came to a head, I had been promoted to 22. After he passed away, I received a very nice salary, and Jonathan did too. You would think that would be the time to be tempted to stay, but we were more prepared than ever at that point. When will Jonathan be ready? I mean, it was the struggle and breaking of me, pleading with God. Thus, This residence is prepared for sale. I'm prepared for a fresh start. We can pick from 50 states. We sacrificed everything for the sake of truth. If we just accepted the charade, set aside our morals, read the card, congratulate my mom on her marriage, and kept not questioning anything about Pete. Susie and Jonathan felt more than just betrayed. They were ill. They anticipated safety, responsibility, and at the very least openness. Instead, however, they received deflection, quiet, a refusal to accept reality, and, worst of all, an insistence on keeping the peace and moving on. Subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, they were advised that the way forward was still open to them if they could simply let it go, smile on camera, say the right things, and behave as though nothing was wrong. As long as they cooperated, the platform, the money, and the presidency were all there. Jonathan, however, was unable to do so. Susie couldn't either. While they were still coping with the trauma in their own family, the thought of feigning admiration for Joni's recent marriage to a sex therapist was too much. They were expected to pretend like nothing was wrong. Like their beliefs didn't matter, like their daughter wasn't harmed, and like Pete wasn't a threat. The unwritten rule was that don't say anything. Don't move. And the true cost became apparent when they failed to do so. All of a sudden, Jonathan's formal pledge to be president was irrelevant. The succession plan that was documented was disregarded. Forgotten are the years of sacrifice and devotion. It became evident that you lose everything if you spoke out, really speak up. The Lambs were gradually driven out by quiet exclusion rather than a public controversy or a spectacular firing. Gatherings to which they were not invited. 2. Discussions behind their backs, and decisions taken without their input. Death by 1,000 cuts was the result. Additionally, Jonathan and Susie found it more difficult to get by each day. Friends became aloof. Co-workers didn't look at each other. They were accused of causing discord, and some even questioned their intentions. Mostly because they were honest. It's all because they didn't fake. They also took a severe financial damage. The steady income they had at last attained disappeared. The income and stability they had relied on were gone, but they still had a mortgage, expenses, and children to raise. They felt alienated in their own house after rising to the top of the ministry food chain. They kept asking themselves, was it worth it, throughout it all, and the answer wasn't always simple. On difficult days, it seemed as though all they had strived for had eluded them. Their future, their reputation, their comfort, everything was gone. However, parents would remember why they had spoken up in the first place after taking a glance at their daughter. Retaliation wasn't the point. The goal was not to prove anything. It was about refusing to celebrate a system that had failed them and others, about defending what was important, and about ensuring that the truth wasn't hidden behind a public relations campaign. People frequently believe that there is freedom and tranquility when you speak the truth. And in the end, that is accurate. But loss comes first. A truly agonizing loss. And Susie and Jonathan had to go through it all. The lack of communication, the disinterest, the internet gossip, the money losses, and the perplexity of those who simply didn't understand. They did not do interviews to gain notoriety. For attention, they didn't post statements. They simply could not continue to live in deception. And they had to pay for it. Most people won't ever see it. However, they also benefited from this. A clear conscience, tranquility, and clarity. Their integrity was not exchanged for power. When their daughter needed them to talk, they didn't remain silent. And they left with their heads held high when they eventually left the cameras, the titles, and the empire behind. They lost everything, yes. However, it provided them with something even more worthwhile. The capacity to sleep at night while being aware. They made the correct decision. The ministry wasn't the only place where the surface fishers existed. They were a part of the system, the silence, and the belief that religious people should nod and smile despite their inner cries. That silence was broken by Jonathan and Susie. By doing this, they served as a reminder to both themselves and the rest of the world that truth is important, even at great personal sacrifice. There comes a time in life when you can finally achieve what you have been striving for. For Jonathan Lamb, the glimmer of empire and the burden of legacy accompanied that moment. The title belonged to him. He had the scheme. He was promised in writing to inherit Daystar, his father's billion-dollar Christian network. He was to inherit everything his family had created. It was not just a job. It was a vocation. Or so he believed. But what happens if you lose your soul in the process of assuming that crown? Jonathan had been the center of attention as a child. Sermons, church attire, lights, and cameras. He was used to this. He didn't chase after it. He had a natural aptitude for it. Additionally, that life was accompanied by pressure in addition to affluence. It was more than simply a name to be the son of Marcus Lamb. It was expected. The mass. Jonathan was burdened from an early age with the responsibility of carrying on that legacy. And that burden increased following the death of his father. Jonathan initially made an effort to carry it like everyone anticipated. He assumed the position of vice president, assumed leadership, conducted polished interviews, wore a suit, and grinned for the camera. Susie supported him behind the scenes, keeping everything together as a mother, a wife, and a deeply religious lady. They made an effort to accommodate the family, the ministries, for the audience members. But over time, fissures became apparent. The work wasn't the issue. The public pressure wasn't even the cause. What they were being urged to ignore was the true issue. Susie and Jonathan were both feeling ill due to events occurring within the Daystar universe. There should have been celebration instead of accountability, silence instead of truth, and, worst of all, a perverse demand. Even if it means concealing the suffering, preserve the image. Everything changed when their little daughter was the victim of what they said was an inappropriate encounter with Pete, a Daystar employee and family friend. Legacy was no longer the focus. It ceased to be about responsibilities and roles. It became very, very intimate. Justice was what they want. They desired openness. However, they received deflection instead. Nobody wanted to discuss it. Nobody wanted to talk about what had occurred. Rather, the message was unambiguous. Proceed. Do not disturb the peace. Keep the brand safe. Susie and Jonathan, however, were unable to do so. Not in the role of parents. Not as religious people. Not as individuals attempting to live in truth. They then became aware of the crown they were being offered, but the cost was too high for them to pay. Quiet. They could have stayed, of course. If only they had smiled, played the game, kept their questions to themselves, praised Joni's stunning remarriage to sex therapist Doug Weiss, and remained silent about Pete. Everything would have been theirs. Nothing felt worth it anymore, not even the empire, the power, the money, or the kind of life most people aspire to. Thus, they took a choice that altered everything. They left. They didn't leave in a fit of rage. They weren't furious when they went public. They just were no longer able to lie. And loss accompanied that decision. Significant and agonizing loss. They sacrificed all that came with the promise of leadership, including pay, perks, contacts, and public perception. It destroyed Jonathan's chances of becoming president. Not because he refused to fake it, not because he failed. Their choice had nothing to do with revolt. It has to do with honesty. Knowing they had remained mute, they were unable to look their daughter in the eye. They couldn't live in deception and teach her about truth. They then proceeded to stroll. To walk away was to sell their home, get out of town, and start over. Trading was required. Consolation for belief. Above all, though, it meant putting their faith in God in the face of an unclear future. Because once you leave the empire, all you have is faith, no safety net, no map. Many folks were unable to comprehend. They were referred to being dramatic by some. They were accused by others of causing discord in the family. Some accepted the narrative that the current leadership had given them, according to which Jonathan and Susie resigned because they were upset about not being promoted to the top position. But the reality was visible to those who paid attention. There was no tantrum here. It was a silent, agonizing gesture of compliance. Two people made the decision to put their morals ahead of their comfort behind the lights, the cameras, and the brand. Putting one's faith before notoriety. They lost everything materially as a result of their choice, but they gained something in return that money cannot purchase. Calm. They didn't leave with resentment. They left in peace. Not the phony type you plaster on for a crowd. The authentic sort. The kind of feeling you get only when you've done the right thing, even if it hurts. The most daring thing that Jonathan and Susie had ever done was to leave the throne. It was the holiest, though. Because sometimes you don't need cameras and money to build the kingdom you're intended to. Quiet obedience, letting go of the spotlight, and trusting that God will accomplish more with your submission than you could have with your achievement are sometimes the first steps. There is more to their story than a government scandal or a family dispute. It serves as a reminder of what true discipleship of Christ entails. Not simply when things are easy, but when everything is at stake. It's about deciding to tell the truth when telling lies is more advantageous. It comes down to putting your child's safety ahead of your personal image. It's about eventually realizing that the crown was never the point and deciding to leave it behind. Even when Jonathan and Susie Lamb left Daystar's throne, they ultimately entered something even more powerful. A life based on something that cannot be purchased or sold, a life of honesty and conviction. The truth. Following all of their losses, following their departure from titles, pay, cameras, and the prospect of a Jonathan and Susie Lamb did not lose their billion-dollar enterprise. They remained intact. They refrained from being resentful or retaliatory. They used a much more difficult approach instead. Peace was their choice. But don't get me wrong, peace wasn't easy. Peace was achieved in the crucible. The peace that followed the expense. And it was all about the price. When leaving Daystar meant more than just quitting a job. It had to do with letting go of a future they had been promised. Jonathan was raised to be a leader. He was the heir apparent, the son. Documents and a plan were present. Everything was in writing. Everyone in their vicinity was aware of it. That vision had provided them stability, direction, and a sense of purpose for years. However, when that pledge conflicted with their conscience, they had to decide when the truth was too difficult and silence was expected. And they did. It was the right thing to do, not because it was clever or strategic. And that choice completely upended their lives. In the name of obedience, they had to give up their jobs, their money, their homes, and their communities. It seemed like free fall at first. According to Susie, it was like holding your breath underwater, unsure of if or when you would come to the surface. Everyone had their own opinions. Rumors are quick to spread. They were portrayed as rebels by some. They were accused of dishonoring family by others. Others simply remained silent because they were too shy or uneasy to raise questions or speak up. Nevertheless, something was subtly developing in their hearts despite all the chaos and tragedy. Calm. Not the kind of existence that is ideal. Not the type you get when you're getting what you want. There was true peace here. Honest, earned, and unvarnished. The sort that only emerges when you've been stripped naked, put to the test, and made to face your true self. They started rebuilding gradually and without much fanfare when no one was looking. Just the two of them, their children, and a God they continued to trust despite the lack of titles, fame, or inheritance. Didn't really comprehend what he was doing. Jonathan resumed his speech, but this time he did not use a script or a pulpit. His words were genuine. Quietly on the internet at kitchen tables in living rooms. The narratives lacked polish. They were human, honest, and painful, but they existed. And people began to pay attention. They witnessed something unexpected, not because they were looking for rumor. Liberty. Susie discovered her voice as well. She had been the quiet one for years. The devoted wife behind the scenes, the support network. However, she was now taking steady, quiet steps ahead. She began talking about what it was like to give up security in order to pursue the truth. What it meant to put your faith in God after all your safety nets had been torn away. What it seems to be able to raise children in the wake of public betrayal while maintaining a belief in virtue. Naturally, their children did not fully comprehend anything. How were they able to? However, kids witnessed their parents put morals ahead of comfort. They witnessed their environment grow a little more desolate, their family shrink, and their home grow quieter. Because there was truth instead of pressure. Rather than acting. Freedom existed. Jonathan and Susie started breathing again in the midst of everything. On some evenings, they sobbed. There were, of course. They questioned God why on certain nights. On those nights, they experienced the pain of what may have been, the weight of uncertainty, and the sting of rejection. However, something started to mend gradually. Due to the fact that when you sacrifice everything for obedience, God never deserts you. In the stillness, in the uncertainty, in the silence, He meets you. And He did precisely that. They started to perceive God in the little things as well as the large ones. Without any deadlines, over coffee in the morning. After months of silence, in their daughters laughing. On an unobserved walk outside, everything seemed to be in harmony. Their hearts calmed in the silence. They have lost everything because of obedience. However, it had also provided them with something they were unaware they were lacking. Calm. That is independent of results. In one of his first public statements following his separation, Jonathan put it best. Empires fade, thus even if peace meant losing the empire, it was still worth it. However, tranquility endures. They have no regrets about their decision. Not once. It was still uncertain what lay ahead. The bills remained authentic. Their souls were free, but the wounds were still raw. They were no longer required to maintain a facade, perform a role, or support a system that had become disoriented. All that mattered was that they were faithful, honest, and flawed. They started to create a new life, one founded on truth, modest steps, silent trust, and genuine faith rather than on titles or legacy. They had more candid conversations with their children. They prayed differently, asking for strength rather than success. They also gave up on attempting to be the person that everyone wanted them to be. Jonathan and Susie made the decision to drop down in a society that is fixated on moving up. They opted for authenticity in a culture that values appearance. They made the decision to speak in a system that promotes silence. And when they had to pay for obedience anything, they discovered something amazing. It was sufficient.